Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of ego defense mechanisms.
Those fascinating and often sneaky tactics our minds use to protect us from anxiety.
Exactly. And to guide us through this deep dive, we'll be using Anna Freud's book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense.
A really pivotal work in psychology where Anna Freud synthesized decades of her father Sigmund Freud's observations on this topic.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Sigmund Freud himself recognized Anna's expertise and tasked her with compiling all his scattered thoughts into this one book.
Yeah, it speaks volumes about the impact of her work in this field. So get ready to uncover the most common defense mechanisms.
And see how they might be playing out in your everyday life.
You know, what's particularly captivating about these defense mechanisms is how they tie back to Freud's theory of personality structure.
The Eads, ego, and superego.
Right. Think of it this way. You have these three parts of your personality that are constantly interacting.
Like an ongoing internal dialogue.
Exactly. So your id is that primal, instinctual part of you, driven purely by pleasure.
The I want it now part of us.
Exactly. That urge for immediate gratification no matter what.
Makes sense. What about the superego? Where does that fit in?
Well, the superego is like your moral compass. All those rules and values you've internalized from society and your upbringing.
So it's like the voice of reason, keeping the id in check?
You could say that.
Yeah.
And then there's the ego, which is stuck in the middle, trying to balance these two often conflicting forces.
So it's like the ego is constantly mediating between the id's demands for pleasure and the superego's moral restrictions.
Exactly. And when those demands from the id become too strong, well, that's where the defense mechanisms come into play.
It's like the ego's toolbox for managing anxiety.
Precisely. The ego steps in with these defense mechanisms to prevent forbidden impulses from reaching our conscious awareness.
So they're like these unconscious strategies that help us navigate difficult or threatening situations.
Exactly. They protect us from feeling overwhelmed by anxiety.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. But can you give me a real-world example of how this might work, say, in an everyday situation?
Sure. Imagine you're stuck in traffic, you're late for a crucial meeting, and your frustration is building.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. Road rage waiting to happen.
Right. So your id might be screaming, just honk the horn, cut people off, get their NWE. But your superego is there, reminding you that those actions are rude and could even be dangerous.
Yeah, and that's where the ego steps in with a defense mechanism.
Exactly. Instead of giving in to those primal urges, your ego might deploy something like rationalization.
Rationalization.
Yeah, you start thinking, well, maybe this traffic is actually a blessing in disguise. It's giving me time to mentally prepare for my meeting.
So you're basically finding a way to reframe the situation to make it feel less stressful.
Precisely. Or maybe you distract yourself by listening to a podcast.
Maybe even one about ego defense mechanisms.
Exactly. A point is, your ego is finding ways to manage the anxiety and keep things in check.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about suppressing those urges, but finding a way to manage them in a more acceptable way. And Anna Freud identified several specific tactics, right?
Exactly. She outlined a whole range of defense mechanisms, but we'll focus on 5 key ones that you'll likely recognize in yourself and others.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. What's the first one?
Let's start with repression. This is considered one of the most basic and common defense mechanisms.
Repression, okay. What does that look like?
Essentially, it's pushing those disturbing thoughts, feelings, or even memories completely out of conscious awareness, like burying them deep down where you don't have to deal with them directly.
So it's not just forgetting, it's actively pushing those uncomfortable thoughts away.
Exactly. And Freud believed that this was a primary way the ego dealt with anxiety-provoking impulses.
So if someone had a traumatic experience in childhood, they might repress those memories to avoid the pain.
Precisely. But it's important to note that those repressed memories don't just disappear. They can manifest in other ways.
Like maybe as anxiety or unexplained phobias.
Right. Freud even suggested that repressed desires can influence your behavior in subtle ways, leading you to make choices you don't fully understand.
It's almost like those repressed memories are still there, lurking beneath the surface and influencing our thoughts and actions.
Exactly. They can have a powerful impact, even if we're not consciously aware of them.
That's pretty powerful stuff. Repression is like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It might stay down for a while, but it's bound to pop up somewhere else. What's the next defense mechanism we're going to unpack?
Next, let's look at regression.
Regression, okay. What is that?
It involves retreating to behaviors from an earlier, safer developmental stage when you're faced with anxiety or stress.
So like acting more childlike when you're sick or feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. Have you ever noticed how some people tend to get more whiny or demanding when they're not feeling well?
Yeah, totally. It's like they're seeking comfort in those familiar behaviors from childhood.
Precisely. Or think about those adults who have a midlife crisis, suddenly buying a sports car or drastically changing their appearance.
Yeah, trying to recapture their youth.
It could be seen as a form of regression, an attempt to recapture a sense of youth and vitality, to go back to a time when things felt simpler and less stressful.
It's fascinating how these defense mechanisms can manifest in such diverse ways. What's the next defense mechanism on our list?
Let's explore projection.
Projection. What's that all about?
It's when you attribute your own unacceptable impulses or feelings to someone else. You're basically seeing your own dirt in their behavior, even though you might not be consciously aware of it.
So instead of acknowledging those uncomfortable feelings within yourself, you're projecting them outward onto others.
Exactly. It's a way of externalizing those feelings to make them feel less threatening.
But that sounds like it could cause some serious problems in relationships, right?
Absolutely. Imagine you're struggling with feelings of inadequacy at work. Instead of facing those feelings head-on, you start projecting them onto your colleagues. You might perceive them as incompetent or even trying to sabotage you.
Wow, so you're essentially creating this distorted reality where everyone else is the problem, not you.
That's a classic example of how projection can really mess with your perception.
But if the person projecting isn't aware of what they're doing, how can they ever address those underlying issues?
That's the tricky part. Projection allows you to avoid those uncomfortable feelings, but it doesn't actually resolve the underlying issue.
It's like sweeping dirt under someone else's rug. Might feel good for a moment, but it just creates a bigger mess in the long run.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these defense mechanisms can be both helpful and harmful. What's the next one on our list?
Next up is reaction formation.
Reaction formation. All right, what's going on there?
This is where you adopt exaggerated behaviors that are the opposite of your true desires or impulses.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine someone who secretly hates their job. They might go overboard praising their boss and acting super enthusiastic about every task, even if they're dying inside. So they're overcompensating to convince themselves and others that they don't actually feel those negative feelings.
Exactly. Or think about a person who's struggling with attraction towards someone they consider off limits.
Like a forbidden crush.
Right. Instead of acknowledging those feelings, they might become overly critical or even hostile toward that person.
Almost like they're trying to prove to themselves and everyone else that they have no interest whatsoever.
Precisely. It's like that Shakespearean quote, "The lady doth protest too much, methinks." Their exaggerated behavior is a big clue that something else is going on beneath the surface.
Wow, reaction formation really highlights how complex and layered these defense mechanisms can be. This is getting really interesting. I'm already starting to see how these play out in my own life and the people around me. What's the last defense mechanism we're exploring today?
Let's finish with sublimation.
Sublimation. Okay, tell me about that one.
This one is often considered the healthiest of the defense mechanisms.
Healthiest. That sounds promising.
It involves channeling those unacceptable or anxiety-provoking impulses into socially acceptable, even productive outlets.
So instead of acting on those urges directly, you find a way to express them in a way that's actually beneficial.
Exactly. It's like taking those lemons and making lemonade. You're transforming those potentially negative impulses into something positive and constructive.
Okay, I like where this is going. Can you give me a concrete example?
Absolutely. Think about someone with aggressive impulses. Instead of acting out in a harmful way, they might become a surgeon, using their precision and focus in a way that actually helps others.
So they're channeling that energy into a profession where it can be used for good.
Exactly. Or someone with a strong need for control might become a successful entrepreneur, channeling their energy into building a thriving business.
That makes a lot of sense. So instead of repressing or denying those impulses, sublimation allows you to channel them into something beneficial. It's like harnessing the power of that inner drive without letting it control you.
Precisely. And sublimation can manifest in countless ways, from artistic expression to athletic pursuits to social activism. It's all about finding healthy and fulfilling outlets for those urges that might otherwise cause anxiety or lead to destructive behaviors.
This is fascinating. It's like we all have this potential to transform our inner struggles into something beautiful and meaningful. So, to recap, we've explored 5 key defense mechanisms: repression, regression, projection, reaction formation, and sublimation.
each serving as a way for our ego to manage the demands of the id and superego, ultimately protecting us from anxiety.
And helping us navigate the complexities of life.
Precisely. And it's really remarkable, how much insight you can gain just by being aware of these defense mechanisms.
Right, because it's not like we're consciously choosing to repress our feelings or project them onto others. It's all happening beneath the surface, right?
Exactly. It's an unconscious process. So it's not about judging yourself or others for using them.
So it's more about understanding them than trying to control them.
Right. Precisely. And while they can be helpful in the short term, allowing us to cope with stress and maintain some sense of equilibrium,
Sure.
over-reliance on them can actually hinder personal growth.
Oh, interesting. So it's like they're a temporary fix, but not a long-term solution.
Exactly. Think of it like using crutches for too long.
Okay.
Eventually, your muscles weaken and you become dependent on them.
Ah, I see. So how does that apply to defense mechanisms?
Well, if you're constantly repressing your emotions or projecting them onto others, you're not really addressing the root of the problem.
Right, you're just avoiding it.
Exactly. And that pent-up energy, that unresolved conflict, can manifest in other ways.
Like how?
Maybe as anxiety, physical symptoms, even relationship problems.
Right, because it has to go somewhere.
Exactly. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Eventually, it's going to pop up somewhere else.
That's a great analogy. So how can we know if we're relying too heavily on these defense mechanisms? Any red flags we should watch out for?
That's a great question. One sign might be recurring patterns in your life, particularly in relationships.
Oh?
Maybe you constantly attract partners who are emotionally unavailable, or you tend to sabotage your own success at work.
So these patterns could indicate that there are unresolved issues or repressed emotions that are influencing our choices.
Precisely.
But how do we even begin to unravel those patterns?
Well, it's important to approach this self-exploration with compassion and curiosity, not judgment.
Right.
Remember, these defense mechanisms are there to protect you,
Yeah.
to shield you from overwhelming anxiety.
So it's not about beating ourselves up for having them.
Exactly. It's about understanding why they're there in the first place, and then finding healthier ways to cope with those underlying issues.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about the potential downsides of defense mechanisms, but you mentioned earlier that sublimation is considered the healthiest one. Why is that?
Well, sublimation stands out because it allows you to channel those potentially disruptive impulses into something positive and constructive.
Right, you mentioned that before. It's not about denying or suppressing those urges, but transforming them.
Exactly.
Can you give me some more examples of how that might look in someone's life?
Absolutely. Imagine someone with a really strong need for order and control.
Okay.
They might become an incredibly successful organizer.
Oh, I see. Like helping others declutter their homes and create systems for efficiency.
Exactly. Or perhaps someone with a deep fascination with the darker aspects of human nature.
Okay.
They might become a crime novelist, exploring those themes in their writing.
Right, so they're channeling that interest into a creative outlet.
Exactly. And in doing so, they're not only expressing themselves, but also potentially captivating readers and helping them process their own emotions.
That's a great example. So it seems like sublimation is about finding a way to make peace with those parts of ourselves that we might otherwise find unsettling or even unacceptable.
You've got it. And the beauty of sublimation is that it allows those impulses to fuel creativity, productivity, and personal growth. It's about harnessing that energy and channeling it into something meaningful.
It's like those ancient alchemists who were trying to turn lead into gold.
Yeah.
Sublimation seems to be about turning those raw, potentially negative impulses into something precious and valuable.
That's a beautiful analogy, and I think it really speaks to the transformative power of sublimation.
Yeah.
It's not about erasing those impulses, it's about finding a way to integrate them into your personality in a healthy and fulfilling way.
This is incredibly inspiring. It makes you wonder if we can consciously cultivate sublimation in our lives. Or is it something that just happens more organically?
That's a fascinating question, and I think the answer is both.
Okay.
While some people might naturally gravitate towards sublimation, it's also a skill you can develop with awareness and intention.
So what are some steps we can take to cultivate sublimation in our own lives?
Well, first, it's about becoming more aware of your own patterns and tendencies.
Okay.
What are those recurring themes or impulses that seem to drive your behavior? What are those things you might be trying to repress or deny?
So getting to know ourselves on a deeper level, understanding those parts of ourselves that we might not always want to admit are there.
Precisely. And then it's about experimenting with different outlets and activities that allow you to channel those impulses in a positive way.
Like what? What are some examples?
It could be creative writing, playing music, volunteering in your community, or even just starting a new hobby.
Right. Finding something that resonates with us.
The key is to find something that allows you to express those energies in a way that feels authentic and fulfilling.
So we have the power to shape our own destinies by choosing how we channel those inner drives.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's about recognizing that those impulses are a part of who you are. They're not something to be feared or ashamed of. It's about finding a way to work with them, to harness their power for good.
This has been such an illuminating conversation.
It really has.
But before we wrap things up, I'm curious, is there still debate in the scientific community about the validity of defense mechanisms?
Oh, yes.
We've been talking about them as if they're accepted psychological facts, but I've heard that some researchers question their existence altogether.
You're absolutely right to bring that up. While defense mechanisms are widely discussed and referenced in psychology, there's still ongoing debate about the extent to which they can be scientifically validated.
Really?
Yes. Some critics argue that they're difficult to measure and test empirically, and they question whether they're truly unconscious processes.
So how do we reconcile those opposing viewpoints? Should we take the concept of defense mechanisms with a grain of salt?
I think it's important to approach any psychological concept with a healthy dose of critical thinking.
Sure.
While there might not be definitive scientific proof for every aspect of defense mechanisms, their enduring presence in psychological discourse speaks to their value as a framework for understanding human behavior.
So even if we can't measure them precisely, they still provide us with a valuable lens to view our own experiences and the actions of others.
Exactly. They offer us a way to make sense of those seemingly irrational behaviors, those moments when we act in ways that even we don't fully understand.
Right.
They remind us that there's often more going on beneath the surface.
That's a good point.
A complex interplay of motivations and emotions that shape our choices and interactions.
This deep dive has been truly eye-opening. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on myself and the people around me. It feels like we've just scratched the surface of this fascinating subject.
It really is a vast and intricate topic, but I think even this basic awareness is a powerful tool.
You keep saying that. How understanding these defense mechanisms helps us understand ourselves and others better. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. Think about it this way. The next time you find yourself getting overly defensive in a conversation, take a step back and ask yourself, what am I protecting here? Is it my ego? Is it some deep-seated insecurity? By understanding the defense mechanism at play, you can start to unravel those deeper motivations.
Right.
And perhaps even find more constructive ways to communicate.
So instead of just reacting, we can start to respond with more self-awareness.
Exactly. And this awareness extends to our interactions with others, too.
Okay, how so?
When you encounter someone who's behaving in a way that seems irrational or even hurtful, try to see beyond that surface behavior.
Okay.
And ask yourself, what might this person be defending themselves from?
Oh, that's a powerful shift in perspective. So instead of judging or labeling someone, we can try to understand the underlying pain or fear that might be driving their actions.
Precisely. It's about cultivating empathy and compassion.
Right.
Recognizing that we all have our own unique ways of coping with the challenges of life.
That's a good point.
And sometimes those coping mechanisms, those defense mechanisms, might manifest in ways that seem strange or even counterproductive.
This reminds me of that quote by Carl Jung. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's like the behaviors that bother us the most in others are often reflections of our own unacknowledged shadows.
That's a brilliant connection.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of self-reflection. By examining those things that trigger us, those behaviors we find particularly annoying or off-putting, we can gain valuable insights into our own defense mechanisms, our own vulnerabilities, and our own areas for growth.
So it's a two-way street. By understanding defense mechanisms, we can better understand ourselves and the people around us.
Yes.
Leading to more compassionate and fulfilling relationships.
Absolutely. And it's an ongoing process, a lifelong journey of self-discovery and understanding. The more we learn about these subtle psychological dynamics, the more equipped we are to navigate the complexities of human interaction.
With more grace and wisdom. This deep dive has been truly transformative. It's amazing how much we've unpacked in such a short amount of time.
I agree.
But I know we've only scratched the surface of this vast and intricate topic.
That's true, but that's the beauty of it. There's always more to explore, more layers to uncover, but I think we've laid a solid foundation for you to continue this journey.
I think so too. So as we wrap up this episode, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they leave this deep dive?
I would encourage you to just pay attention to those moments when you feel anxious, threatened, or even triggered.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, what defense mechanism might be at play here?
Mm.
Am I repressing something? Am I projecting my own feelings onto someone else?
Right.
Or maybe even channeling my energy into something productive through sublimation?
So it's like we've been given this decoder ring for human behavior.
Exactly. By becoming more attuned to these subtle psychological dynamics, you can gain a deeper understanding of your own motivations and the motivations of others.
That's a great point.
And with that understanding comes a greater sense of empowerment, compassion, and freedom.
This has been such an incredible deep dive into the world of ego defense mechanisms. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on myself and the people around me. I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your expertise.
It's been my pleasure.
And remember, everyone, this is just the beginning of your exploration. Keep observing, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating realm of human psychology. Until next time.